There's a certain kind of sound a house makes when it's been lived in for a long time. Floorboards that remember feet. A cabinet door that closes the same way every time. The soft, familiar rattle of keys in a bowl by the door. When you're younger, you tend to hold on tightly to things, objects, plans, versions of yourself. Not always because you love them, but because letting go feels like losing, like stepping off a ledge without knowing what's below. I used to think letting go was something you did in one brave moment, a clean decision, a sharp goodbye. But age teaches you something quieter. It teaches you that most goodbyes are not dramatic. They arrive slowly. A friend you don't call back as quickly as you used to. A coat you stop reaching for. A hobby that once mattered, now resting on a shelf like a photograph. And somewhere along the way, you notice you're not gripping life with the same white-knuckled force. Not because you don't care, but because you've cared enough times to understand what stays and what doesn't. There's a kind of tiredness that comes with years, yes, but there's also a kind of relief. The older you get, the more you realize how heavy it is to carry old arguments in your chest. How exhausting it is to keep replaying a sentence that cannot be unsaid. How much space a resentment takes up, even when you pretend it isn't there. And then, one day, you set something down. You might not even announce it to yourself. You simply stop picking it back up. Sometimes it's a grudge. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's a dream that belonged to a younger version of you, one who thought life had to unfold in a certain order to be worth anything. Aging doesn't make you careless. It makes you selective. It teaches you that peace is not something you win. It's something you protect. And letting go is often the first quiet act of protection. When you're young, you collect things without realizing you're collecting them. Not just objects, though those pile up too. You collect expectations. You collect beliefs about how life is supposed to go. You collect the need to be understood, the need to be chosen, the need to be right. And because you're still building yourself, everything feels important. Every friendship, every relationship, every mistake. Even the disappointments feel like they've stamped your name into the world. So you hold on. You hold on to people who have already walked away in the quiet ways people do. You hold on to conversations that ended badly, as if replaying them could create a different ending. You hold on to the version of yourself who was stronger, or prettier, or more confident, or simply less tired. Aging doesn't erase any of that. It doesn't wipe the slate clean. What it does is give you enough time to see patterns. You start to recognize the kind of pain that teaches you something and the kind that only drains you. You begin to notice which parts of your suffering are inevitable and which parts are self-maintained. Because some things truly happen to us, and some things we keep alive long after they've stopped happening. There's a quiet moment many people reach, often later than they expected, when they realize they've been carrying a story for years. A story about a parent who didn't know how to love them well. A story about a marriage that ended and the way it made them feel like they'd failed. A story about a sibling, a friend, a child, someone who didn't turn out the way they hoped. A story about the years that went by too quickly, or the chances they didn't take. At first, those stories feel like proof. Proof that you were wronged, proof that you were not enough, proof that you should have done better. And because they feel like proof, You don't want to let them go. If you set the story down, it can feel like you're saying it didn't matter. But here's what age slowly teaches, if you let it. Letting go is not the same as pretending. It's not denial. It's not rewriting the past in a prettier ink. Letting go is simply refusing to bleed forever from the same wound. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes after you've carried something heavy long enough to feel it reshape your posture. When you're younger, you may think strength is endurance. You may think it means taking anything life hands you and holding it until your fingers cramp. But later, strength starts to look like something else. It starts to look like saying, "This is costing me too much." It starts to look like choosing sleep over another late-night argument in your head. It starts to look like silence, where there used to be a need to explain yourself. Sometimes, letting go begins with a small decision. You don't make it with fireworks. You make it in the grocery store, when a memory shows up and you don't chase it down the aisle. You make it in the car when you realize you've been driving with your shoulders up around your ears and you let them drop. You make it at the kitchen sink, staring out the window, and you notice you're breathing. And for once, you're not bracing for anything. It can feel almost ordinary, but it changes you. Because the more years you live, the more you understand something that youth can't quite accept. Most of life is not solved. It is carried. And then, eventually, it is set down. Not because you found perfect closure, but because you've learned the difference between what you can mend and what you can only forgive. And forgiveness at this age is often less like a grand gesture and more like unclenching your hand. You don't have to love what happened. You don't have to approve of it. You don't have to invite it back into your life. You simply stop gripping it like it's the only thing that proves you existed. Because you did exist, with or without the story. And there comes a point when you'd rather live the years you have left than keep visiting the years that hurt you. That's when letting go starts to feel easier. Not easy, just easier. There's another kind of letting go that doesn't come with a heartbreak or a big turning point. It comes quietly, in ordinary places. It shows up in closets. One day you open a drawer and realize you haven't touched half of what's inside for years. Not because you were too busy, not because you forgot, just because your life moved on and the drawer didn't. There's a small sadness in that, a soft little sting, because every object is tied to a version of you. The shoes that belong to the body you had at 40, the dress you wore to a wedding where you still believed in forever, the toolbox from a time when your hands didn't ache afterward, a stack of greeting cards from people who don't write anymore or aren't here anymore. When you're younger, you keep these things like proof that time was real, that love was real, that you were once someone very particular. But later in life, something shifts. It's not that you stop caring about the past. It's that you stop needing to keep every piece of it in your house. Some people reach a point where they begin to give things away, and it surprises them how it feels. Not like loss, more like air moving through a room that's been closed too long. You don't always notice how heavy your life has become until you start lifting it. And it's not only objects, it's roles. For years, many of us are the responsible one, or the strong one, or the one who fixes problems, who keeps the peace, who holds everyone together. Sometimes we never chose those roles. They were handed to us early, and we wore them until they became skin. But aging has a way of loosening what once felt stitched in place. The children grow. The work ends or changes or becomes less central. Friends pass away. Families scatter. The phone gets quieter. And without the constant noise of obligation, a person may finally hear themselves. It can be unsettling at first, because when you've been needed for a long time, being less needed can feel like being less valuable. That's one of the hardest things to let go of, the belief that love must be earned through usefulness. But time has a way of teaching you that presence matters, even when you aren't performing, even when you aren't fixing, even when you aren't holding everything up. There are relationships, too, that change shape with age, not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it's just that the jokes don't land the same. The phone calls feel strained. The long history between you becomes more weight than comfort, and so the connection thins. That can feel like failure when you're younger, like something you should repair, chase, rescue. But later, many people begin to accept a quieter truth. Not every bond is meant to last in its original form. Some people were meant to be your companion for a season. Some were meant to teach you something. Some were meant to show you what you cannot live with. And then they drift. Not because you are heartless, but because you finally understand the cost of trying to force closeness where there is no longer tenderness. There is also the letting go of how you imagined life would look. The older you get, the more you notice how many of your plans were never really yours. They were ideas picked up from movies, from parents, from neighbors, from a culture that says happiness has a certain shape, a certain kind of marriage, a certain kind of family, a certain kind of house with a certain kind of yard, a certain kind of success that can be explained quickly at a dinner party. For a long time, people chase those shapes, not because they're foolish, because everyone wants to feel safe. Everyone wants to feel they're doing life correctly. But age has a way of revealing what actually nourishes you. It might be smaller than you expected. A morning cup of coffee and a quiet porch. A familiar street. A dog asleep in a warm patch of sun. One friend who listens the way most people never learned to. And when you see that clearly, a lot of striving begins to fall away on its own. The need to impress. The need to keep up. The need to explain your choices. It becomes easier to let go of the life you thought you had to build, because you begin to recognize the life you already have. Not perfect, not always easy, but real. And in that realism, there is a strange kind of freedom. You stop clinging to the idea that everything must be kept. Every object, every connection, every old version of yourself. Because you've lived long enough to know this. What matters doesn't disappear when you let go of the clutter around it. Sometimes, it finally has room to be felt. There's a reason letting go as you age can feel different from letting go when you're young. When you're younger, you often believe that if you release something, you will never get it back, and that nothing equally good will come in its place. So you cling. You bargain with life. You keep old doors cracked open, even when you've already walked out of the room. But later in life, you've seen enough seasons to stop fearing the empty space. You've watched winters that seemed endless soften into spring. You've watched grief change shape. You've watched a day you thought you wouldn't survive quietly turn into a day you barely remember. Not because it didn't matter, but because the human heart has a way of continuing, and that changes how you hold things. Aging teaches you that the mind is not always a trustworthy narrator. It will bring you the same memories at odd times, as if it's trying to hand them back to you like a bill you still owe. A sentence someone said 30 years ago, a look on a face, a choice you made when you didn't know what you know now. When you're young, you might chase those memories. You might wrestle them to the ground, trying to make them behave, trying to pull a clean lesson from them, like a coin from a pocket. But with age, many people discover something quieter. You don't have to solve every memory. You don't have to explain every loss. You don't have to understand every person who hurt you. Sometimes you only have to stop returning to the same pain, as if it's the only place you can be loyal. That's a hard sentence, but it's true. Because loyalty can become a trap when it's directed at suffering. Some people stay faithful to their wounds for decades. They keep the hurt polished and ready because it feels like justice, because it feels like protection, because if they let it go, they fear they'll become naive again. But the older you get, the more you realize you can be wise without being armored. There is a difference between being open and being unguarded. Letting go isn't the same as forgetting what happened. It's remembering it without handing it control of your day. It's the moment you notice your body reacting. Tight throat, clenched jaw, that familiar heat in the chest. And instead of feeding it, you simply name it. There it is again. And you breathe. That sounds small, almost too small. But that is often how peace is built at this age, not through big victories, but through small refusals. Refusing to rehearse, refusing to prove, refusing to carry what someone else should have carried. Another thing happens as you age. Your relationship with time becomes more honest. In youth, time feels like it belongs to you. There's always more of it, somewhere ahead. So you can postpone forgiveness, postpone rest, postpone happiness. You can wait until the perfect conditions arrive. Later, you stop believing in perfect conditions. You begin to understand that life doesn't open up like a neatly planned road trip. It opens like weather, unpredictable, sometimes harsh, sometimes beautiful for no reason at all. And that understanding brings a kind of simplicity. You start asking quieter questions. Not, how do I make everything turn out the way I wanted? But, what do I want to carry into tomorrow? Not, how do I fix the past? But, how do I soften my grip on it? Not, how do I win? But, how do I live without always bracing? There's a deeper kind of acceptance that can arrive in older years, the acceptance that your life is not a courtroom. You don't have to keep presenting evidence. You don't have to keep arguing your case. You don't have to convince the world you were right to feel what you felt. You are allowed to step out of the room. Some people think letting go means you stop caring. But what often happens is the opposite. You begin caring more carefully. You stop pouring yourself into what cannot hold you. You stop investing your energy where there is no return, no tenderness, no respect. Not as punishment, not as revenge, just as a matter of preservation. Because by this stage of life, you've learned something most people learn too late. Your attention is your life. Where you place it, that becomes your days. And your days become your remaining years. So you start placing your attention differently. You place it on what is simple, and true. On a conversation that doesn't require you to perform. On a quiet afternoon that doesn't need to be productive. On the small, steady things that were never glamorous, but were always real. And little by little, the old weight loses its authority. Not all at once, not like a door slamming shut, more like a hand opening, more like setting down a bag you forgot you were carrying and feeling for the first time in a long time how your shoulders were meant to rest. Sometimes people talk about getting older as if it's only loss, as if the story ends with things being taken away. But there's another side to it, one that isn't loud enough to make headlines, but is real in the quiet hours. As you age, you don't just lose things. You also lose your appetite for carrying what never belonged to you in the first place. You begin to notice how much of your life was spent trying to hold together what was already falling apart. Trying to make certain people understand you. Trying to prove you were good, worthy, lovable, responsible. All the things you were even before anyone agreed. And then, slowly, you stop. Not because you've given up, but because you finally learned what your energy is for. It's for living, for breathing without a tight chest, for waking up and not immediately returning to an old sorrow like it's part of your morning routine. It's for the small moments that don't ask you to be impressive. A warm cup held between your hands, the comfort of a familiar chair, the way late afternoon light lands on the floor and makes even a plain room look gentle. A voice on the phone that doesn't rush you. These things don't demand that you carry the past to earn them. And if you're in a season right now where you feel yourself loosening your grip on a person, a plan, a memory, a version of who you thought you had to be, you don't have to force it. You don't have to rush it. Let it happen the way most real changes happen, quietly. One day you realize you haven't replayed that moment in a week. One day you notice the anger isn't as sharp. One day you can think of someone's name without your stomach tightening. And you understand something simple. You didn't erase your story. You didn't betray your younger self. You didn't pretend it didn't hurt. You just stopped letting it take up the whole room. That's what people mean when they say, letting go becomes easier as you age. Not because life stops mattering, but because peace starts to matter more. And you've lived long enough to recognize it when it arrives, even in a small form, even in a quiet evening, even in the simple act of setting something down and letting your hands finally be free.